After a grueling week of travel and work, Malcolm Simmons returned to his quiet home on Willow Street in Bakersfield, California, craving nothing but a peaceful afternoon in his backyard. The sun cast long shadows as he settled into his favorite chair, a glass of iced tea in hand, with smooth jazz melodies softly drifting from his portable speaker. His loyal dog, Ace, wagged his tail, basking in the calm with him. But that calm was shattered when an unfamiliar woman approached the fence with a sharp glare, accusing Malcolm of trespassing on his own property. Her voice was curt, her stance confrontational, and her hand hovered near her phone as she threatened to call the police. Malcolm tried to keep his tone level, explaining that he had lived there for 5 years and could provide identification and proof of residence. Undeterred, the woman made the 911 call, claiming a suspicious black man was lurking in the backyard, her voice unwavering as she added an insinuation of danger. Within minutes, flashing lights and sirens filled the street. Malcolm's heart raced, not from guilt but from the weight of the scene unfolding. He calmly met the officers with his hands raised, explaining and showing his ID and mail as proof of ownership. His doorbell camera, which captured the woman's false accusation, became his defense. Though the officers eventually confirmed Malcolm's story, the damage was done. This quiet, ordinary man, simply enjoying his hard-earned home, had been reduced to a suspect in the eyes of a neighbor who refused to see him as belonging. The incident was just the beginning of a larger reckoning for the neighborhood, and for Malcolm himself. Malcolm Simmons's peaceful afternoon in his own backyard took a dark and unexpected turn that rippled far beyond the quiet neighborhood of Willow Street. It began with him savoring a rare moment of calm after a taxing work trip, his dog Ace at his side, and the soft hum of jazz music playing from his speaker. But as Malcolm reclined into the serenity of his backyard, an unfamiliar woman approached his fence with an expression of suspicion and hostility. Her tone was sharp and accusatory as she claimed he didn't belong there. Despite his polite explanations and offers to provide proof, her phone was already in hand, and she dialed 911, reporting a suspicious black man trespassing on private property. Malcolm's heart raced as sirens pierced the air within minutes, and 2 police officers arrived, tense and wary. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Malcolm calmly raised his hands and identified himself, presenting his ID and mail to confirm he was the rightful homeowner. However, the woman, undeterred, insisted that he wasn't the owner, citing the previous elderly resident she had known. What unfolded next was not just an isolated misunderstanding but a deeply rooted societal issue that played out in front of the entire neighborhood. The police eventually accepted Malcolm's identification and doorbell footage, which clearly documented the woman trespassing and making false claims, though no charges were pressed against her, and she left with little more than a verbal reprimand. The damage had already been done. Malcolm's sense of security in his own home had been fractured, and his reputation in the neighborhood questioned. His video of the incident, posted later, quickly went viral, sparking outrage and conversations about racial profiling and systemic bias. Strangers from across the country reached out to share similar experiences, while local activists and neighbors expressed both support and regret for their silence. The woman's accusations, so confidently made, revealed not just her personal biases but the ease with which suspicion can be weaponized against someone who doesn't fit the profile. The neighborhood, once a quiet haven, now found itself at the center of a broader discussion about prejudice, accountability, and community responsibility. As Malcolm considered legal action, attended neighborhood meetings, and received both messages of solidarity and veiled hostility, he realized he had inadvertently become a symbol of resilience and quiet defiance. His simple act of standing firm in the face of false accusations resonated far beyond Willow Street. Malcolm's story serves as a powerful reminder that injustice doesn't always roar. It often whispers from the shadows of everyday life, waiting for someone to turn on the light. Malcolm Simmons hadn't planned to become a face for neighborhood confrontation or a symbol of everyday injustice. Yet, as the police cars lined the curb and curious neighbors peeked from behind curtains. His afternoon of backyard tranquility transformed into something bigger when the woman, Carolyn DeWitt, though Malcolm would later learn her name, falsely reported him as an intruder in his own yard. She triggered not just a personal violation, but a community-wide reckoning. Malcolm's calm, measured demeanor in the face of escalating tension contrasted sharply with Carolyn's certainty and the office's initial skepticism. The footage from his doorbell camera, uploaded to social media with a simple caption, "She told me to leave my own home," spread rapidly, sparking a firestorm of conversation about implicit bias and the assumption of guilt based on skin color. For Malcolm, the days that followed weren't about vindication. They were filled with a quiet determination to stand in his truth and a growing awareness that his story wasn't just his own. Neighbors he'd barely spoken to before, like Loretta McKinney and Tyrell from 2 blocks over, approached with words of support. Some expressed regret for not stepping in when they saw police arriving. Others admitted they'd never imagined something like this could happen in their quiet suburb. However, Malcolm also noticed the shift in tone, the uncomfortable glances, the whispered comments, the flyer with his photo taped to the neighborhood mailbox. It wasn't just about Carolyn anymore. It was about the system that allowed her assumptions to carry weight and the silent consent of those around her. When Malcolm attended the local WA meeting, he hadn't planned to speak. But when Carolyn stood up, attempting to reframe her actions as a misunderstanding made out of concern, something inside Malcolm couldn't stay silent. His words, calm, clear, and deeply personal, cut through the tension in the room. He spoke not with anger, but with the exhaustion of a man who had long understood how assumptions and silence create harm. Neighbors listened, some with downcast eyes, others with quiet nods. The meeting ended without resolution, but it marked a shift in the dynamic of the neighborhood. As the video continued to gain traction, Malcolm became the recipient of messages from strangers, some sharing their own experiences of being judged or dismissed because of how they looked. Civil rights organizations reached out, journalists requested interviews, and local leaders began discussing policy changes. Still, Malcolm wrestled with the idea of legal action. He wasn't seeking financial compensation or revenge. What he wanted was something more enduring, a recognition of the harm done and a commitment to change. Eventually, Malcolm decided to speak at a community forum organized by concerned neighbors. There, standing in a modest church hall, he shared his story not for attention, but to remind everyone of the power of assumptions and the cost of silence. "I didn't post that video to make a point," he said. "I posted it because I didn't want to be erased." His words resonated, prompting quiet applause and, more importantly, introspection. Conversations shifted from whispers to open dialogue, and Malcolm's quiet resilience became a catalyst for change. In the end, Malcolm didn't sue, but he continued to work with a local housing rights group, helping to organize community meetings that fostered open discussions. His backyard, a once unassuming slice of suburban life, became a symbol of resistance, of standing firm in truth even when it's uncomfortable. Malcolm's story wasn't about heroism or confrontation. It was about dignity, the simple right to exist in peace, and the profound impact of breaking the silence. And though the world moved on, Malcolm's quiet stand left a mark, one that whispered to neighbors, "We can do better." When Malcolm Simmons sat quietly on his back patio, sipping iced tea and letting the smooth strains of jazz fill the air, he never imagined that a false accusation would ripple through his neighborhood, forever altering the dynamic of a community. It started so simply, an afternoon of relaxation, a brief encounter with a neighbor, Carolyn DeWitt, who intruded on his peace by assuming he didn't belong. Her call to 911, complete with the claim that Malcolm was a suspicious black man, set off a chain of events that revealed not just her personal biases, but the cracks in a neighborhood that had prided itself on quiet and civility. As the police arrived, neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering and speculating. Malcolm's calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to Carolyn's assertive certainty. When the officers checked his ID and reviewed the security footage he provided, their realization of the mistake was immediate. Yet the damage wasn't contained. The video Malcolm uploaded later that day sparked a wider conversation. Initially posted for friends, it quickly went viral, reposted by civil rights advocates and news outlets alike. The image of a black man standing calmly in his backyard, juxtaposed with Carolyn's accusations, became a symbol of the everyday prejudice that so often goes unspoken but simmers just below the surface. Malcolm never intended to become a public figure or a movement's rallying point. His decision to speak at the local WA meeting was born not from a desire for fame, but from a quiet determination to ensure that his experience didn't fade into the background. His words at the meeting were measured, not angry, but resolute. "I didn't post the video to go viral," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "I posted it because I didn't want to disappear." His message struck a chord, prompting both support and uncomfortable reflection. In the weeks that followed, Malcolm noticed subtle shifts in his neighborhood. Some neighbors, like Loretta McKinney and Tyrell, offered genuine support. Others kept their distance, their avoidance speaking louder than words. A flyer, anonymously taped to a community mailbox with a photo of Malcolm, illustrated the tension that still lingered. Yet amidst the quiet hostility were moments of hope. A handwritten note from a neighbor acknowledging the need for change. A local teacher inviting him to speak to students about his experience. And growing conversations about racial profiling and community accountability. Malcolm's journey wasn't one of dramatic courtroom battles or fiery protests. Instead, it was a story of resilience, of a man who chose to stand in his truth. Even when it was uncomfortable, he worked with local advocacy groups to start community conversations, aiming to build bridges where once there were walls. He rejected the easy path of silence, opting instead to share his story, not for sympathy, but to spark understanding. Through it all, Malcolm remained grounded. His backyard, once a haven for solitude, became a quiet testament to his strength. There, with his dog Milo at his side, he continued to listen to jazz, sip iced tea, and reflect on the journey that had begun with a neighbor's false accusation. He didn't just reclaim his space, he redefined it. His story, while deeply personal, resonated far beyond his street, serving as a reminder that dignity, truth, and quiet courage can indeed disrupt deeply rooted prejudice. In the end, Malcolm's story wasn't just about a single incident of racial bias. It was about the resilience to reclaim one's space and the power of speaking truth. Not to tear others down, but to build a foundation for a more honest, reflective, and inclusive community. And though the headlines faded, his quiet stand remained, a testament to the idea that change begins not with grand gestures, but with one person refusing to be erased. Malcolm Simmons never planned to be a voice for change. He wasn't seeking the spotlight or looking to ignite debates. He just wanted to enjoy a rare, quiet afternoon with his dog, Milo, in his own backyard. But when his neighbor Carolyn DeWitt falsely accused him of trespassing and called the police, what should have been a peaceful moment turned into a catalyst for a much larger conversation. Initially posted to his social media as a way to document and process his experience, the video of the encounter quickly caught the attention of neighbors, local activists, and eventually national audiences. In a matter of days, Malcolm's backyard became more than just a place of solitude. It became a symbol of both everyday racism and the quiet resilience needed to challenge it. The footage spoke volumes. Viewers saw a calm, respectful man calmly presenting his ID and video evidence, juxtaposed with Carolyn's defensive accusations and refusal to acknowledge her mistake. The stark contrast resonated with many, prompting conversations not only about what happened but why it happened. Why was a black homeowner so easily presumed a threat in his own space? Why were the police called so swiftly and unquestioningly? As the video circulated, it wasn't just Malcolm's story. It became a mirror for communities across the country. revealing the insidious undercurrents of bias that too often go unspoken. Malcolm's response wasn't fueled by anger but by a quiet determination to ensure that what had happened to him wouldn't be swept aside or dismissed. He worked with local organizations to organize community forums, not to shame or accuse, but to foster genuine conversations about prejudice, privilege, and the simple human right to feel safe at home. At these gatherings, he shared his story, not as a victim, but as a neighbor, a person who wanted nothing more than to enjoy his home in peace. His words were simple but carried a quiet power. "I didn't post the video to make a scene. I posted it so no one could say it didn't happen." As the forums continued, Malcolm found himself surrounded by neighbors who had initially remained silent but now felt compelled to speak. Some offered apologies, others shared their own experiences of bias or ignorance. The conversations were messy, uncomfortable, and at times painfully honest. But they were also necessary. It became clear that this wasn't just about a single misunderstanding between two neighbors. It was about the need for an entire community to confront and address the biases they had long overlooked or ignored. The local homeowners association, once dismissive of Malcolm's concerns, began to feel the pressure from the broader community. When Carolyn eventually stepped down from her role, it was more than just a personal consequence. It was a signal that the community was ready to start holding itself accountable. Yet Malcolm knew that real change wouldn't come from one resignation or a few meetings. It would take ongoing effort, patience, and the willingness to keep the conversation going even after the headlines faded. Malcolm's journey from quiet backyard afternoons to reluctant community leader wasn't without its challenges. He faced awkward glances from neighbors, received anonymous notes of both support and hostility, and grappled with the pressure of being seen as a symbol for a struggle much larger than himself. But through it all, he remained steady. His focus wasn't on winning arguments or gaining followers. It was on creating a space where everyone, regardless of race or background, felt seen and heard. The most powerful thing about Malcolm's story wasn't the video that went viral or the media attention that followed. It was his quiet refusal to be erased. By standing firm in his truth, by opening up conversations that many would rather avoid, he transformed a personal violation into a catalyst for reflection and, hopefully, for lasting change. In the end, Malcolm Simmons didn't just reclaim his backyard, he reclaimed his right to exist, to be seen, and to be heard, not just as a homeowner, but as a human being. His story reminds us that sometimes, the most profound changes begin not with grand speeches or public protests, but with one person standing quietly and saying, "I belong here, too." Malcolm Simmons never set out to be a catalyst for change, but life has a way of writing stories when we least expect it. It was just a quiet afternoon, a simple moment of rest after a long week, with a cool drink in hand and the comforting presence of his dog Milo. In his own backyard, a space he built through hard work and determination, Malcolm thought he could finally exhale. But the confrontation with his neighbor Carolyn DeWitt turned that peace into a spark that ignited a fire of conversations far beyond his neighborhood. What began as a false accusation rooted in prejudice escalated into a broader reckoning, exposing not just individual biases, but the collective blind spots of a community. The real weight of Malcolm's story wasn't just in the immediate aftermath, the officers verifying his residency, the viral video, or even Carolyn's eventual resignation from the homeowners association. It was in what came next, in the subtle but undeniable shifts in the neighborhood's atmosphere. Conversations that had once been avoided or downplayed were now impossible to ignore. Malcolm's neighbors, many of whom had previously watched from the sidelines, found themselves grappling with uncomfortable truths. Some offered words of support, others retreated into silence, and a few lashed out anonymously. Through it all, Malcolm remained composed, understanding that real change doesn't come overnight. It's messy, layered, and often slow. Malcolm's decision to engage, to participate in community forums, and to work with local housing rights organizations wasn't born from a desire for attention or retribution. It was a commitment to creating a space where voices like his couldn't be dismissed or ignored. These gatherings weren't about pointing fingers, they were about fostering understanding. He shared his story with honesty and vulnerability, not to play the victim but to highlight the very human cost of everyday prejudice. His message was simple yet profound. I didn't post the video for attention. I posted it because I didn't want it to be denied. As weeks passed, Malcolm found himself becoming a quiet leader, someone neighbors looked to when navigating these newfound conversations. It wasn't a role he sought, but one he embraced because he understood its necessity. He recognized that change would require patience, persistence, and a willingness to have the same uncomfortable conversations repeatedly. He knew that for every neighbor who approached him with an apology or a handshake, there were others who would cling to old narratives, refusing to see their own biases. But even those silences were shifting, however slowly. The power of Malcolm's story lay not in a single viral moment, but in his steadfast refusal to let it fade into obscurity. By continuing to show up, to neighborhood meetings, to casual porch conversations, to school classrooms, he kept the narrative alive, weaving it into the community's fabric. His story forced people to look at themselves, to question their assumptions, and to recognize the subtle ways bias manifests in everyday interactions. It wasn't about shaming individuals. It was about holding up a mirror to a community that had long avoided its reflection. And through it all, Malcolm stayed grounded. He continued to enjoy his backyard, not as a defiant act, but as a reclamation of his right to peace. Milo still chased squirrels and lounged in the sun. The same dog that had witnessed it all. The jazz still played from the speakers. The same melodies that had filled the air before the incident. But everything had changed. Malcolm's backyard wasn't just his sanctuary anymore, it had become a symbol. A quiet reminder that standing firm, speaking truth, and fostering dialogue can ripple outwards, creating waves of awareness and, eventually, change. In the end, Malcolm's story isn't just about one man's resilience in the face of prejudice. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of defiance are the quietest, the refusal to be unseen, the choice to stand up, and the commitment to speak when silence would be easier. His journey invites all of us to reflect, to listen, and to consider. What would we do if faced with the same challenge? Would we look away, or would we choose to listen, learn, and change? That's the question Malcolm's story leaves us with, and it's one we can't ignore. The events of that Thursday afternoon forever shifted the way Malcolm Simmons viewed his world, and how his world viewed him. When he first returned home to his peaceful backyard, all he wanted was a moment of quiet. But what unfolded wasn't a fleeting misunderstanding, it was a collision of assumptions, power dynamics, and deeply ingrained biases that forced an entire neighborhood, and beyond, to confront its own reflections. What Malcolm didn't anticipate was how the story would evolve from a personal violation to a broader community reckoning. One that would push him into a position he never sought but couldn't ignore. As the days turned into weeks, the video of Malcolm's wrongful confrontation circulated far beyond his block. Social media lit up with comments, shares, and debates. What resonated wasn't just the injustice of a man being questioned on his own property. It was the stark reminder that such incidents were not isolated. Neighbors who had once nodded politely on morning walks now felt compelled to speak up, to express solidarity, or, in some cases, to retreat into defensive silence. Some left notes of support. Others scribbled anonymous, venomous comments on flyers that were later taped to his mailbox. These dual reactions reflected the uncomfortable duality of progress, one where light and shadow coexisted. Despite the weight of scrutiny, Malcolm found clarity not in legal action, but in community engagement. He chose not to press charges or pursue a lawsuit, understanding that while justice was important, genuine change required more than courtroom decisions. It required dialogue, exposure, and, most critically, consistency. By joining local forums, collaborating with housing rights organizations, and agreeing to speak at community and school events. Malcolm turned his personal story into a shared narrative, one where people from different backgrounds could begin to recognize the systemic issues that bred moments like his. His choice to lead not with outrage but with calm, measured truth made space for others to reflect without defensiveness. However, Malcolm's journey wasn't without its emotional toll. The same quiet strength that allowed him to weather Carolyn's false accusations was tested repeatedly as he faced both support and subtle hostility from those around him. The once familiar faces of his neighborhood now represented a spectrum of reactions, some openly supportive, others cautious, and a few stubbornly resistant to change. Yet, for every uncomfortable silence, there was a voice that emerged, asking questions, expressing curiosity, or simply offering a kind word. These small but significant interactions illustrated the slow, painful process of transformation. One of the most profound moments came not from viral fame or public acknowledgement but from a handwritten letter slipped under his door. It was from a neighbor who admitted to not understanding the weight of what had happened until they saw the footage and heard Malcolm speak at the community forum. The note, though simple, symbolized something larger: the beginning of accountability, a personal reckoning with prejudice, and a willingness to do better. For Malcolm, it wasn't validation but a reminder that change is seated not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, personal decisions to listen and learn. Malcolm's story, though born from a confrontation, became a mosaic of resilience, vulnerability, and leadership. It demonstrated how even the most personal violations can catalyze broader conversations and gradual shifts in perspective. His decision to stand firm against false accusations, silence, and the temptation to disengage offered a blueprint for community-led change. By choosing to engage, to tell his story, and to invite others into the conversation, Malcolm embodied the idea that real transformation starts with acknowledgement and is sustained through connection. His journey invites us to consider our own roles in creating inclusive, empathetic communities. Would we, like some of his neighbors, stay silent and distant, or would we lean in, listen, and commit to doing better? Malcolm's story is a call to action, a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that says, "This isn't right," and then dares to stay in the room, making space for change to take root. The events of that Thursday afternoon forever shifted the way Malcolm Simmons viewed his world, and how his world viewed him. When he first returned home to his peaceful backyard, all he wanted was a moment of quiet. But what unfolded wasn't a fleeting misunderstanding, it was a collision of assumptions, power dynamics, and deeply ingrained biases that forced an entire neighborhood, and beyond, to confront its own reflections. What Malcolm didn't anticipate was how the story would evolve from a personal violation to a broader community reckoning, one that would push him into a position he never sought but couldn't ignore. As the days turned into weeks, the video of Malcolm's wrongful confrontation circulated far beyond his block. Social media lit up with comments, shares, and debates. What resonated wasn't just the injustice of a man being questioned on his own property. It was the stark reminder that such incidents were not isolated. Neighbors who had once nodded politely on morning walks now felt compelled to speak up, to express solidarity, or, in some cases, to retreat into defensive silence. Some left notes of support, others scribbled anonymous, venomous comments on flyers that were later taped to his mailbox. These dual reactions reflected the uncomfortable duality of progress, one where light and shadow coexisted. Despite the weight of scrutiny, Malcolm found clarity not in legal action, but in community engagement. He chose not to press charges or pursue a lawsuit, understanding that while justice was important, genuine change required more than courtroom decisions. It required dialogue, exposure, and, most critically, consistency. By joining local forums, collaborating with housing rights organizations, and agreeing to speak at community and school events, Malcolm turned his personal story into a shared narrative, one where people from different backgrounds could begin to recognize the systemic issues that bred moments like his. His choice to lead not with outrage but with calm, measured truth made space for others to reflect without defensiveness. However, Malcolm's journey wasn't without its emotional toll. The same quiet strength that allowed him to weather Carolyn's false accusations was tested repeatedly as he faced both support and subtle hostility from those around him. The once familiar faces of his neighborhood now represented a spectrum of reactions, some openly supportive, others cautious, and a few stubbornly resistant to change. Yet, for every uncomfortable silence, there was a voice that emerged, asking questions, expressing curiosity, or simply offering a kind word. These small but significant interactions illustrated the slow, painful process of transformation. One of the most profound moments came not from viral fame or public acknowledgement but from a handwritten letter slipped under his door. It was from a neighbor who admitted to not understanding the weight of what had happened until they saw the footage and heard Malcolm speak at the community forum. The note, though simple, symbolized something larger: the beginning of accountability, a personal reckoning with prejudice, and a willingness to do better. For Malcolm, it wasn't validation but a reminder that change is seated not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, personal decisions to listen and learn. Malcolm's story, though born from a confrontation, became a mosaic of resilience, vulnerability, and leadership. It demonstrated how even the most personal violations can catalyze broader conversations and gradual shifts in perspective. His decision to stand firm against false accusations, silence, and the temptation to disengage offered a blueprint for community-led change. By choosing to engage, to tell his story, and to invite others into the conversation, Malcolm embodied the idea that real transformation starts with acknowledgement and is sustained through connection. His journey invites us to consider our own roles in creating inclusive, empathetic communities. Would we, like some of his neighbors, stay silent and distant, or would we lean in, listen, and commit to doing better? Malcolm's story is a call to action, a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that says, "This isn't right," and then dares to stay in the room, making space for change to take root. As the dust settled around the viral storm of Malcolm Simmons's encounter with his neighbor, the reality of what had happened continued to reverberate through his community. The incident was no longer just about a false accusation. It had grown into a dialogue that exposed deep-seated biases, forced uncomfortable conversations, and, ultimately, highlighted the power of resilience and quiet strength in the face of injustice. What began as an ordinary afternoon in his backyard had transformed into a pivotal moment for not only Malcolm but also his neighbors, who were now grappling with the implications of their silent complicity. In the weeks following the incident, Malcolm found himself at the center of a maelstrom of media attention, legal inquiries, and community reckonings. Yet amidst the public noise, a quieter, more significant shift was unfolding within his neighborhood. Where once there had been avoidance and suspicion, there were now tentative steps toward acknowledgement. Neighbors who had previously waved in passing were now stopping to offer apologies, share personal reflections, and express their regret for not intervening. The neighborhood Facebook group, once filled with polarized arguments and defensive posturing, began to transform into a space where people were asking questions and reflecting on their own behaviors. Conversations moved from online comments to in-person dialogues at local gatherings, creating a ripple effect of awareness that extended beyond Echo Street. Malcolm, however, understood that real change couldn't be sustained by a single story or a viral video. Determined to turn this painful experience into a platform for meaningful action, he collaborated with a local housing rights organization to establish monthly community meetups. These gatherings, initially attended by only a handful of residents, gradually grew as more people recognized the importance of addressing the underlying issues of racial profiling and implicit bias. At these meetings, Malcolm didn't deliver impassioned speeches or point fingers. Instead, he shared his story with calm conviction, inviting others to reflect on their own roles in perpetuating systemic inequalities. One such meeting was particularly transformative. A middle-aged neighbor, Wesley, who had remained silent during the initial fallout, stood up and admitted, "I used to think this kind of thing didn't happen in our neighborhood. I thought it was just internet drama. But seeing that footage and hearing Malcolm speak, it made me realize how blind I've been." Wesley's honesty resonated with many in the room, breaking down barriers that had kept people from engaging authentically. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a genuine admission of ignorance and a step toward change. The momentum continued to build as Malcolm received invitations to speak at local schools, churches, and civic organizations. His message remained consistent. This wasn't just about him or one incident. It was about the insidious nature of bias that can permeate even the most seemingly peaceful communities. He emphasized the importance of listening, of asking better questions, and of creating spaces where everyone felt seen and valued. His story, once a source of frustration and disbelief, became a catalyst for community-wide introspection and growth. Even the Homeowners Association, which had initially responded with indifference, was forced to confront its role in maintaining an environment where such incidents could occur. After several board meetings marked by heated discussions and heartfelt testimonials from residents, Carolyn, the neighbor who had falsely accused Malcolm, stepped down from her position. Her resignation wasn't accompanied by an apology, but it marked a symbolic shift in the community's willingness to hold individuals accountable for their actions. Through it all, Malcolm remained grounded in his purpose. He didn't seek fame or accolades. He sought understanding and change. His quiet determination inspired others to speak up, to challenge their own biases, and to take small but meaningful actions toward building a more inclusive and just neighborhood. His story serves as a powerful reminder that change doesn't always come in waves of dramatic action. Sometimes, it's the steady, persistent work of one individual refusing to be silenced, and the ripples that follow, that truly transform a community. For those reading or listening to Malcolm's story, there's a challenge to consider. How will you respond when confronted with bias or injustice? Will you remain silent, or will you find the courage to speak up, even in the face of discomfort? Let this story be a reminder that true change begins with awareness, grows through honest dialogue, and is sustained by actions that reflect the values we wish to see in the world. If Malcolm's journey resonates with you, don't just read and move on. Share this story, start a conversation, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, because the path to a better community and a better world starts with each of us. In the quiet aftermath of a viral confrontation, Malcolm Simmons sat on his back porch, gazing out at the same backyard where everything had started. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows, and Milo, his loyal dog, lay curled at his feet. The jazz music that once brought him peace played softly from his speaker. But the tranquility felt different now, weighted with the echoes of the past weeks. What had begun as a simple desire for a restful afternoon in his own yard had spiraled into a national conversation about bias, justice, and the quiet indignities that too many face in silence. As Malcolm reflected on the journey he never intended to take, he realized the true depth of the lesson he had learned. Change, no matter how small, begins with one voice choosing not to be silenced. Malcolm hadn't set out to become a symbol. He hadn't wanted to be the face of a cause, to navigate the minefields of public attention, or to bear the responsibility of representing a broader struggle. All he had wanted was a few moments of peace, a slice of normalcy in a world that too often felt unforgiving. But when confronted with Carolyn's baseless accusations and the harsh reality of being perceived as a threat in his own home, he made a choice. He chose not to shrink. He chose to stand, and in doing so, he taught everyone watching, whether from a news screen, a classroom, or a neighbor's window, that courage doesn't always come in grand speeches or public protests. Sometimes, it's the quiet dignity of refusing to let your truth be denied. The neighborhood, too, began to shift. Conversations that had once been avoided were now at the forefront. Apologies, both spoken and silent, were offered. Even Carolyn's eventual resignation from the WA marked a moment of reckoning. Malcolm understood, however, that true change wouldn't come from one resignation or a few supportive gestures. It would come from sustained, collective action, a community learning to see past assumptions and embrace shared humanity. For anyone reading or hearing Malcolm's story, there's a deeper message. The way we see each other matters. The assumptions we make, the narratives we choose to believe, the silence we maintain when confronted with injustice, all of it shapes the world we live in. Malcolm's experience was not unique, but his decision to speak out was powerful. It's a reminder that we cannot afford to be bystanders. Whether it's offering a kind word to a neighbor, standing up against bias, or simply listening with an open heart, every action matters. So here's the challenge, and the heartfelt plea. If this story touched you, if it made you think, even for a moment, about the world we're creating for ourselves and for future generations, then let's not stop here. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, your experiences, or simply your support. Start a conversation in your own community. And most importantly, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the stories that need to be told. Because together, through small, deliberate acts of empathy and courage, we can create ripples that turn into waves of change. Let's not wait for the next Malcolm Simmons to show us what's possible. Let's be the ones who choose to see, to speak, and to stand, starting today.